The defenders of Armageddon thought him dead. They had been fighting for months without him, grinding through a war of attrition against an orc tide so vast it had turned the sky green with spores, and blotted out the sun over a dozen hive cities. The general staff had written him off. Some had begun whispering that the old man's legend was just that. A legend, the kind of story soldiers tell themselves in the dark when the ammunition is running low and the walls are cracking. Then the transmission came in, crackling and distorted through the static of a war zone, and the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Clipped, cold, furious. Sebastian Yarrick was not dead. He was coming home, and he was bringing the war with him. The making of a commissar. Sebastian Yarrick did not begin as a legend. He was born Sebastian Varden on the world of Taos III, the son of merchants, and orphaned at 7 years old. With no living family left to speak of, the boy was sent to live with his grandfather, a retired Imperial Guard veteran who had served as a sergeant and understood that sentiment was a poor substitute for survival. The grandfather's training methods were rough by any standard. He paid local thugs to beat the boy until Sebastian stopped taking the beatings and started asking for lessons. When Orks invaded Taos III, Sebastian's grandfather was killed fighting them. The boy, not yet in his teens, spent 3 years alone on the world, surviving in the forests, laying traps for greenskins, and in at least one documented account, freeing a group of humans the Orks had been keeping as provisions. A guard contingent eventually found him. The commissar attached to that unit recognized something in the boy and arranged for him to be taken into the Schola Progenium. Sebastian took his grandfather's surname when he arrived. He emerged from the Schola as Yarrick. Initially on track for the Stormtrooper Corps, Yarrick served in that role for several years after graduation before transferring to the commissariat. His first posting as a full commissar was alongside a classmate named Dominic Seroff, the pair of them placed under the tutelage of Lord Commissar Simeon Rasp, and attached to the 77th Mortisian Infantry during an investigation on the planet Mistral. A long career followed, a dozen war zones, service with regiments from Necromunda, Luther McIntyre, and Armageddon's own planetary defense forces. Through all of it, he studied the Orc mind. At some point during those years, he learned the Orc language from a human raider who had survived captivity among the Greenskins on the world of Varun, and he became one of the Imperium's genuine experts on how Orc warfare actually operated, as distinct from how most Imperial officers assumed it did. By the time he settled into Armageddon's PDF, Yarrick was already old by any conventional measure. He had no politics, no faction, no ambitions beyond the next campaign. He wore his gray hair and scars without vanity. The only thing he had ever truly pursued with any personal intensity was the understanding of one specific enemy, and he had been doing it his entire life. He was still doing it on the day the Green Tide came. Armageddon and the First War. Armageddon is one of the Imperium's most vital hive worlds, a planet of colossal industrial output and dense population, its surface divided between scorched equatorial wastelands and the enormous hive cities that tower over them. It had already endured one apocalyptic conflict before Yarrick ever set foot on its soil. The first war for Armageddon was fought in 444 M41, when the daimonic forces of Angron, the demon primarch of the World Eaters, descended on the planet in a tide of blood and slaughter. The Space Wolves bolstered the collapsing defenses while the Grey Knights, the Ordo Malleus's most classified weapon, a chapter whose very existence was officially a secret, teleported into the heart of the demonic horde and banished Angron from the material world. The aftermath became known as the Months of Shame. The Inquisition, bound above nearly all other considerations to protect the secrecy of the Grey Knights, ordered the mass mind-wiping and execution of the survivors who had witnessed the chapter in action. Logan Grimnar, Great Wolf of the Space Wolves, never forgave it. The bitterness cut deep between the Adeptus Astartes and the Ordo Malleus and never fully resolved. The planet was repopulated, rebuilt, and rearmed over the centuries that followed, but the institutional memory of both the war and what followed it left marks on Armageddon's defense culture that did not disappear with the rebuilding. Yarrick studied the First War carefully after arriving with the PDF. He read every surviving account and drew one central conclusion. The fundamental failure had been psychological. The defenders had not been prepared for what they were facing, and that unpreparedness had broken them faster than any tactical reversal. He filed extensive recommendations about psychological and spiritual preparation for unconventional threats. They were largely ignored until they proved prophetic. The Second War for Armageddon. Von Straub and the Banishment. The Second War for Armageddon began in 941 M41. Yarrick had already served in a dozen campaigns with the Planetary Defense Forces and was on Armageddon to oversee the founding of the 4th Armageddon Regiment. He was in fact scheduled to retire on the very day the first alert came in. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka was not an ordinary Ork warlord. He had been gifted with a steel skull following catastrophic wounds received on the planet Urk, had received what the Orks understood as direct visions from Gork and Mork, and had spent years planning this invasion rather than simply hurling his forces at the nearest target. His Wah struck multiple landing zones simultaneously, and within weeks had seized the majority of Armageddon's surface outside its hive cities. Yarrick assessed Ghazghkull immediately as a categorically different threat from anything in the Ork encounter record and ordered the planet's astropaths to call for help. Hermann von Straub, the overlord of Armageddon, countermanded the order. Von Straub was possessed of the particular kind of arrogance that combines genuine incompetence with total certainty of one's own genius, and he was not going to have a commissar circumvent his authority in front of the wider Imperial establishment. He banished Yarrick to Hades Hive as punishment. It saved the planet. Von Straub's stewardship of the wider defensive effort was a catastrophe. Under his command, Armageddon fell piece by piece until the Orks were at the gates of the Hive cities. Hades Hive, meanwhile, had Yarrick. The defense of Hades Hive. Hades Hive sat astride a critical equatorial highway network. Its fall would have opened the route to the planet's primary space docks. Yarrick had fewer men, less ammunition, no reliable resupply, and an enemy that outnumbered him by ratios that should have been conclusive. He knew exactly what Ork commanders expected from a defensive engagement, and he refused to give it to them. Where Ork commanders anticipated straightforward attrition, mass against mass in corridors and hab blocks, Yarrick ordered tactical withdrawals and counterattacks at points of his choosing. The Hive's industrial infrastructure became a weapon. Gantries were collapsed onto Ork formations. Chemical processing facilities were rigged as improvised explosives. Entire hab levels flooded with promethium and ignited when enemy concentrations justified the cost. Hades Hive was being destroyed, but on Yarrick's terms. Throughout the entire defense, not a single soldier under his command was executed for cowardice. His presence on the line made it unnecessary. The most significant strategic consequence of Hades Hive's resistance was what it did to Ghazghkull. Watching a city that should have fallen in weeks become a months-long exercise in humiliation, the Warboss grew personally obsessed with its reduction. He committed more and more of his forces to the siege. He took personal command of the assault himself. Every Ork pouring into the city's rubble was an Ork not threatening the wider planetary defense, and Yarrick had worked to produce exactly this situation. Ugulhard, the Claw, and the Eye. At the outer wall, Ghazghkull sent one of his most formidable sub-commanders to break Yarrick's resistance. The Warboss Ugulhard reached the section of wall Yarrick was defending and severed his right arm with a sweep of his power claw. Yarrick killed Ugulhard with a chainsword. Then he had his medikey cut the claw from the dead Warboss's wrist and wore it in place of his missing arm for the remainder of the campaign. The mythology that built up around Yarrick among the Orks had multiple sources. There was the claw. There was the red optical lens of his bionic eye replacement, which gave his face a quality the greenskins found deeply unsettling. The Orks came to believe that his eye could kill, that his gaze, fixed on an Ork in battle, would cause that Ork to die from the power it contained. This was not purely delusional. Yarrick's bionic eye was eventually fitted with a concentrated laser weapon, the Bale Eye, and any Ork who had witnessed it fire would have had direct evidence. The mythology outgrew the weapon, though. The evil eye became fixed Ork theology. He cultivated it deliberately, standing at visible positions on walls and parapets, never ducking, making himself seen. The Orks were fighting an idea as much as a man, and ideas do not fall to claw or bullet. Among his own soldiers, the effect was inverse. Men who were days from breaking, who had buried their comrades in rubble and run dry on ammunition. saw the old man standing on the wall and found reasons to fight on. The fall. Hades Hive fell. This is worth stating plainly because the legend sometimes obscures it. The hive was not held until relief arrived. It was ground down by Ghazghkull's massed assaults to the point where Yarrick ordered the evacuation of his surviving forces in a series of daring shuttle runs. In the final stage of the fighting, Ghazghkull attacked personally. Yarrick received a near-fatal wound in direct combat with the Warboss, and hovered close to death during the evacuation. The strategic result was still a victory for Armageddon. The months Yarrick had spent chewing up Ork numbers and drawing Ghazghkull's personal obsession away from the wider campaign had bought sufficient time for the Imperium to respond. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels arrived with substantial Space Marine reinforcements, including forces from the Salamanders, Ultramarines, and Blood Angels, and the counterattack that followed broke the back of the invasion. Ghazghkull withdrew from the system. The Second War for Armageddon was over. Millions were dead. The equatorial steppes were choked with the wreckage of the largest armored engagements in centuries. 3 of the war's greatest figures, Dante, Mannheim, and Yarrick, had monitoring stations in the outer reaches of the Armageddon system named for them during the reconstruction. Yarrick was hailed as the savior of Armageddon. He had no interest in the title. He had one interest: finding Ghazghkull. Golgotha. 3 years after the end of the Second War, in 944 M41, Yarrick formally came out of retirement and requested a military expedition to hunt down Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka before the Warboss could rebuild. The request was granted. Yarrick departed at the head of a significant armored force. The conviction at Imperial High Command was that Ghazghkull was a spent force. Yarrick did not share this conviction, but he went hunting regardless. Golgotha was a trap. Ghazghkull had been waiting. The Imperial advance was ambushed by an Ork force many times what intelligence had suggested, and as Ghazghkull committed his Goths to open battle, a second Ork force that had been lying in concealment hit the Imperial column from behind. During the fighting, Yarrick had commandeered a Baneblade, the vehicle that would become known as the Fortress of Arrogance, but it was crippled by a Stampa and had to be abandoned in the rout. The expedition was shattered to a man. Yarrick was captured. He woke up hanging in chains above a pit on Ghazghkull's space hulk, stripped of his bionic claw and Bale Eye. The Warboss watched him regain consciousness, then sent him plummeting down a waste chute to the laughter of the assembled Orks. Yarrick survived it, spent several days hunting squigs in the dark at the bottom, eventually used their massive quills as improvised rungs to climb back out. Ghazghkull was waiting when he reached the top. Without a word, the Warboss had him thrown in with the other human slave prisoners on the hulk. Yarrick organized a revolt among them. The human work crews had been used haphazardly throughout the hulk as a slave detail, and in the course of their labors had assembled a rough map of a significant portion of the vessel. He wanted to attack what he believed was a temple to the Ork gods, reasoning that Ghazghkull would be there. The other prisoners talked him into attempting escape and warning the Imperium instead. The attempt failed. Their intended extraction vehicle had been customized by the Hulk's mech boys and was no longer flight capable. When discovery became inevitable, one of the group sacrificed himself and started the ruined craft anyway, creating a diversion. The survivors made for the Hulk's bridge instead. Each of them, one by one, gave their life to get Yarrick one level higher. When he finally reached the bridge, he found only mech boys at the stations whom he dispatched. Ghazghkull was not there. Eventually, Ghazghkull had Yarrick brought before him. The Warboss was going back to Armageddon. He told Yarrick this directly. He wanted Yarrick leading the defense when he arrived, because without Yarrick on the other side, the whole exercise was pointless. He gave Yarrick a shuttle and let him go. The other senior commanders from the expedition were not released. They were made into living servitors, their flesh fused to the hull of a captured Imperial transport. Yarrick escaped Golgotha with a Cadian Khazarkan rearguard holding the line long enough for his dropship to clear atmosphere. He returned later at the head of an Adeptus Mechanicus force that included Titans, Skitarii, and an Ordnatus engine, and scoured Golgotha's surface of Orks. Ghazghkull had already gone. The planet was eventually reclaimed by the Greenskins before the Third War began, but it had been denied to them long enough for one other thing. Yarrick had the Fortress of Arrogance recovered. An Adeptus Mechanicus Reclamator expedition found the wrecked Baneblade, repaired it aboard one of the great Mechanicus Arks en route to Armageddon, and had it ready for him when the next war came. The Third War for Armageddon. The Return. The Third War began 57 years to the day after the start of the Second. Ghazghkull returned at the head of a Wa that made the previous invasion look like a raid. Yarrick was not caught off guard this time. He arrived on Armageddon 2 weeks before the invasion began, was offered supreme command of all Imperial forces on the planet by overwhelming vote, and accepted. The Fortress of Arrogance was waiting for him, repaired, refitted, and blessed by the priests of both the Ministorum and the Mechanicum. Ghazghkull opened the war by obliterating Hades Hive from orbit, an asteroid launched from a space hulk, an act of personal vendetta against the city that had defied him. Yarrick had foreseen it. Where another commander might have devoted resources and men to defending the site of the most famous stand of the Second War, Yarrick ordered the evacuation of Hades Hive before the Orks struck. He acted without sentimentality and without hesitation. When the asteroid hit, the city was already empty. His first order of the actual battle was to send every remaining Imperial aircraft against the incoming Ork rocks before they could touch down. He could not stop them all. Hundreds of hollowed asteroids smashed into the surface and provided the Ork landing forces with pre-built fortresses. Yarrick personally led the assault on one of these rocks with a force of Cadian shock troopers. The campaign. The Yarrick who commanded Armageddon's defense in the Third War was not the same officer who had held Hades Hive in the Second. He was older, carrying wounds that would have grounded a younger man, and he brought something to the defense that no other commander on the planet possessed. Years of direct observation of how Ghazghkull operated, gathered from his time as a prisoner on the Warboss's space hulk, and from the moment Ghazghkull told him directly about the return to Armageddon, he used it. Where Ghazghkull expected a repeat of the Second War's grinding attritional slog, Yarrick hit the Wa's momentum rather than its front lines, targeting what the greenskin horde needed to sustain itself rather than simply contesting ground. He brought the mythology back as well. The Orks of the Third War knew who he was. The oral culture of the greenskins had spread the legend of the Evil Eye across every warband that had heard of Armageddon. Orks who had never been near the planet knew Yarrick's face. He stepped back into that mythology deliberately, putting himself at the most visible and contested points of the defense, appearing on walls and at breach points with the same calculated intent as 60 years before. The war ground into stalemate. Ghazghkull, who had visions pointing him towards something larger on a galactic scale, and who grew bored when decisive victory remained out of reach, eventually disengaged and handed the ongoing conquest of Armageddon to his subordinate commanders. The multi-front conflict continued for years after his departure, bleeding enormous Imperial resources and billions of lives. But the planet did not fall. Von Strab, who had been placed under house arrest after the Second War, escaped during the Third and made his way back to Armageddon. He collaborated with the Orks to deliver Hive Acheron to them through sabotage and secret tunnels, then declared himself overlord again with greenskin brute squads backing his claim. Much of the old nobility in the Hive welcomed him back. The Imperium responded by sending Colonel Schaefer's 13th Penal Legion, the last chancers, to kill him. The mission succeeded. Von Strab was gone. The Imperium moved on. The hunt renewed. When word reached Yarrick that Ghazghkull had left Armageddon, he left too. He petitioned High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars to let him join the crusade already forming to pursue the Warboss. Helbrecht agreed. Yarrick departed with a hand-picked force of guardsmen at his back, and the Fortress of Arrogance loaded for whatever came next. They nearly had him. At the Battle of the Haunted Gulf, Yarrick and Helbrecht cornered Ghazghkull's flagship, the Kilrekka. The Warboss vanished into the warp before they could finish the engagement, a blaze of green energy, and then nothing. Yarrick watched it and said nothing for a long moment. He understood what it meant. Ghazghkull was not running. He was building toward the war his gods had promised him since Urk. The Great Wa was coming, and it would be larger than anything that had come before. Declared dead. The opening of the Great Rift in 999 M41 severed Armageddon from the wider Imperium. The Noctis Aeterna, the period of warp darkness that followed, cut astropathic communication across the galaxy and left worlds fighting alone in the dark. Armageddon, already grinding through years of multi-front war with Ork forces Ghazghkull had left behind, now found itself directly in the path of the Blood Crusade, a vast legion of Khorne's demons pouring into real space through the tiers the Great Rift had opened. Khornite forces swept battlefields that no longer followed the laws of reality. In the strangest passages of that war, Ork and Imperial soldiers reportedly fought side by side against the greater threat. Yarrick was somewhere in deep space with Helbrecht's fleet when the rift opened. What happened to him in the period that followed is not on record. During the Era Indomitus, the Divisio Mortis of the Officio Prefectus, the bureau responsible for tracking the deaths of Imperial personnel, circulated a report across war zones and forwarded it to Terra. The report stated that Sebastian Yarrick had been killed. The cause of death was not given. The Bell of Lost Souls at the Imperial Palace told for him. The 9th edition Astra Militarum Codex carried the notice. Yarrick was removed from active service roles, his rules removed from the game, his name placed among the dead. The Imperium put out the bureaucratic equivalent of a sealed coffin and moved on. Armageddon built more shrines. Soldiers who had fought under his command argued in hushed voices about what had actually happened. The theories were many: old age, at last catching a man who should have been dead decades earlier by any reasonable measure. Ghazghkull, finishing what he had started. Angron, whose blood crusade had torn through the Armageddon region and who was known to collect the skulls of worthy enemies. Some noted that a certain skull strung at the Demon Primarch's belt appeared to have a bionic eye. None of it was confirmed. The Imperium lies, and the Divisio Mortis has listed men as dead who later walked off transport ships asking for a briefing. Yarrick himself had been declared dead more than once before. Armageddon is still at war. It never stopped being at war. The Orks Ghazghkull left behind have been fighting for decades, reinforced by new arrivals drawn to the planet's reputation as a place where a greenskin can always find a good scrap. Demonic forces have opened new fronts. The planet has been fighting without its most famous defender for years, and the toll shows. Commanders coordinate the defense with considerable competence and without the singular force of personality that has twice defined what Armageddon's resistance looks like at its sharpest. Then a transmission came through, crackling and distorted through the static of a war zone, on a channel that should have been dark. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, clipped, cold, furious. Yarrick was not dead. He was coming home. He arrived older than anyone had seen him. His body is held together now by servo-enhanced calipers and supports grafted to his frame, the biological infrastructure failing under the accumulated weight of a century of war. The Bale Eye still blazes. The claw is still on his arm. His first act on arrival was to execute a commissar who had issued the order to retreat. He did it without ceremony and without hesitation, holstered the last pistol, and told the soldiers behind him to make ready. The Orks came. He was there. What the legend means. Sebastian Yarrick is the most decorated commissar in the history of the Astra Militarum. The commissariat holds him up as its primary exemplar of what a commissar should be, and regiments across the galaxy are given accounts of his conduct at Hades Hive as part of basic psychological training. Statues of him stand in Armageddon's surviving Hive cities. His face, the red bionic eye, the expression of absolute settled fury, appears on recruiting materials and devotional icons. There are soldiers who pray to him the way they pray to saints. He would hate all of it, probably. Yarrick was not a man who sought his own mythology. The mythology existed because it was useful, and the moment it stopped being useful, he would have discarded it without sentiment. What he actually was is simpler and stranger than the icon. An old man who believed completely in what he was fighting for, who understood that wars are won or lost in the gap between one side's willingness to continue and the other's, and who was willing to stand on walls and bleed and refuse to fall because the soldiers behind him needed to see it. His personal Baneblade is as much a relic as he is. There is a novel, Gunheads by Steve Parker. in which an entire armored tank company undertakes a brutal mission to recover the Fortress of Arrogance from Golgotha, fighting through hundreds of thousands of Orks to bring back one man's tank. Not Yarrick himself, just his tank. This tells you everything about the mythology and nothing about the man. The old man who wore the claw is not a relic. The Imperium said he was dead. Armageddon mourned him. The bell of lost souls tolled, and he came back anyway, because the Orks are still coming and the planet still needs someone who refuses to acknowledge that survival is a reasonable response to the situation. Somewhere in the galaxy, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka is building something large enough to end the war his gods have been promising him since Yarrick is counting on it.